Started. So welcome everyone to this third webinar from the OUTFOX webinar series. So we've had our first webinar was about 4 weeks ago, and there we looked at cell designs and stacks and implications of scaling up. That then led us into a webinar 2 weeks ago, where we looked at more of the stack design and overall system design. And that's now led us to this third webinar, where we're looking at the broader economic implications, the market dynamics for solid oxide electrolysis, but also hydrogen in general. So I'm hoping this will be very interesting for everyone. Just a quick note on logistics. Please use the Q&A function to pose any questions to the speakers. We'll try to allow for about 10 minutes after each presentations for Q&A. And if there's not enough time to answer any questions live, then I'll be asking the speakers to answer that just in the chat as well. So good, we will go ahead and jump right in. So I would first like to hand it over to Dr. Cahit Benel. He's from the high temperature electrolysis team at TNO. He's the coordinator of the OUTFOX project and will just give a very brief introduction to the project.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Erin. And then good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. So quickly, before I just leave the space for the most important people of this webinar, I would like to give a short introduction about the project. I hope you can see my screen. And then, so this is the kind of a one slider to give the most important information about the project. Our mission is to remove the scale as a limiting factor in the deployment of the solid oxide technologies in the large industrial applications, because as you might know that compared to the low temperature electrolysis systems, the scale is very, very small in the solid oxide electrolysis technology. So we have the following approach in this project. In 3 pillars, we are looking at scaling up the sizes, the cells, stacks, and modules. We also look at how to increase the volume of the cost-efficient manufacturing technologies, which will support this. And then finally, we are also looking at increasing the performance in the sense of the current density on cell and stack levels. So on the right-hand side, you see how the consortium is distributed geographically in Europe. So we have in total 9 partners. So today we will be together with Politecnico di Milano, and then which is also supported by Fondazione Politecnico di Milano, and then these are from Italy, and then also Shell is with us today from the Netherlands. TNO is the coordinator, Link also with us today with Erin, so they are doing the consulting, dissemination and communication work for this project. And then from the north of Europe we have Alcogen for cells and stacks development and then manufacturing, and then VTT also doing stack, supporting the stack development with testing and modeling works. So we have started beginning of 2023. So right now we are within our last year of the project, because it was 4 years of project, and we are getting a lot of interesting results. And then the project, of course, is supported by the Clean Hydrogen Partnership and co-funded by European Union. So then with that, I think I will leave the floor to first speaker. So I will give the floor maybe first Erin. Yes. You are muted, Erin.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Good. So I would indeed like to introduce our first speaker. So Dr. Paolo Colbertaldo is assistant professor with the group of energy conversion systems at the Department of Energy at Politecnico di Milano in Italy. His research focuses on the technical and techno-economic assessment of clean energy solutions from the plant level to regional and national scales, with emphasis on hydrogen technologies, energy system integration, and industrial decarbonization. So we're very happy to have him here today to share his insights into the economics of solid oxide electrolysis.
Thank you, Erin, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
And can you see my screen?
It's just loading. Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. I'm gonna dive a little bit into our work within the OUTFOX projects regarding the scaling up. In the past two webinars, we have heard about cell features, cell testing, and the pilot module that we have been implementing. And here we will go a little farther into the scaling up and the assessments of what we can expect from scaling up the technology as we are studying. Just a brief reminder regarding solid oxide electrolysis. The core are the cells grouped into stacks operating at high temperature with electric efficiencies close to 100% or even higher when we are able to operate in endothermal mode. That's valid at cell level, but of course, when you want to move into an actual hydrogen production plant, we have to add some additional components to close all the circuits, and the modularity keeps building on. So from the cell to the stack, we go into the module and then eventually into the plant, where this high temperature core is the crucial element for development, for scaling up, but also all the integration for heat for these high temperature flows to be able to match them and also to arrange with some cooling aspects when we need to separate hydrogen, gives the floor to large heat integration opportunities. Here we have the kind of modularity we have introduced. So stacks are grouped into hot boxes together with the high temperature balance of stack with the high temperature recuperators. These modules will be grouped into units where the low temperature balance of plant, meaning the steam generator, additional recuperative heat exchangers, as well as all the pneumatic circuits will be arranged. And these units will then feed into the plant when we really aim for the hundreds of megawatt or gigawatt scale. And there we will also match with the electricity provision, with the storage units, and so on and so forth. So studying this modularity implies identifying all the joint connections. So the point you can see placed in purple boxes in the scheme. So these are all the moments or the points in the plant where we need to divide our streams. And as you can see, there's several dotted lines. I'm not going into very single details, but the point is that we can identify different level of heat integration from the lowest to the highest with recuperation on the same side, fuel to fuel, air to air, or even matching fuel and air side. And another important comparison we want to look at is to understand how much is important to already have steam provided, which is often the case in the analysis, or what's the impact of having liquid water, and so the impact of the evaporation phase. And the first answer that we get is that in the full scale, we will not have the 100% electric efficiency that we can see at cell or stack level because the other components are bringing in additional consumption points. And the three bars that you can see here refer to the basic liquid configuration with minimal heat integration, the advanced heat integration opportunity, and eventually ST stands for steam. So it's the case where we have steam available. And of course, the height of the bars you can read on the left gives us the specific energy consumption, or on the right the with the dots, you can read the conversion into an efficiency LHV basis, and the numbers do vary quite significantly. So the supply of energy for the conversion of liquid water into steam to be then feed is quite a sensitive point of the configuration, and it's quite important. However, it opens the question into how largely that can be available. So how easy it is, especially for a plant that's strongly aimed to generate hydrogen for a generic user, not specifically integrated into an industrial plant, to have that steam available. Or even when we are in an industrial plant, how can we really assume that that steam is available for free, energetically and economically? Based on these results, we wanted to have a look at the costs, which are definitely a matter of comparison, a relevant matter of comparison in scaling up. The first elements that we are looking here is the impact of increasing the stack manufacturing rate. So for sure, the values that we might compute for our pilot plant in the OUTFOX project are not representative of a full-scale deployment. And even the first plants that are going to be installed in these years, in the coming years, may not be representative, but it's important to look farther, to look beyond. One of our partners, Ercogen, has recently opened a very large manufacturing plant for scaling up the manufacturing. And here we can see how that is important and how the relation between the components in the plant changes along with that. So at the small manufacturing rate, so with the first plants, the stack is the core component and its cost share attain for about 50% of the total. But when the stack manufacturing rate increases, the possibility to improve waste and economies of scales in their plants bring that, the gray area, to a small fraction and shows that other components are important. So it also shows us in the direction of development which other items within the plant we should start looking at. And among these, we can easily identify the high temperature recuperators. We are talking about units for gas-gas heat exchange from 300 to 700 Celsius, and the hydrogen compressor. So this is also not extremely new. We are including the hydrogen compressor in order to make sure that we have an outlet pressure around 20 to 30 bar, which makes it comparable with other hydrogen production technologies. So it's important to us to have a comparative assessment. I mentioned modularity, I mentioned the structure. It's important to outline that every single installation might have different needs and might identify different opportunities for modularity. And especially here, we are looking at the baseline option. So every hotbox containing the high temperature heat exchangers is matched with a rectifier, and several hotboxes are matched with a low temperature balance of plant, each of them with one hydrogen compressor. And as we've seen, hydrogen compressor can be quite the costly element. So one of the first questions that we asked was, maybe we can change the structure. So maybe we can have a more centralized compression system when we have a very large plant. So sharing the compressor into multiple units. And this is quite the advantage. So compressor also has a cost that scales with size. So by sharing the compressor among multiple units, we increase its power, its consumption, and we decrease its cost. So identifying a proper trade-off between the compressor size and the unit size can be impactful on the total cost. Here we are seeing some 20% CAPEX reduction, which can be quite significant. The other option is to work on the smallest scale, so on the hot box. So instead of having the given number of stacks that we had earlier, we might think of having a larger number of stacks, which in turn, depending on the manufacturer choice, might mean the same number of cells with larger cells, the same number of stacks with more cells per stack, or so on. And in this configuration, what we are impacting on is going to be mostly the rectifier, so the electric control system and the high temperature recuperators. And in this case, we can see an impact on cost reduction from the original baseline to the final scale that goes up to the 40% of CAPEX reduction. So even here, the scaling up, being able to offer larger cells, being able to stack a larger number of cells can provide advantages. So not just about the performance of the single cell, but also about how we combine everything into reaching a full-scale system. When we then want to switch from studying the CAPEX to studying the levelized cost of hydrogen, so the actual cost of our final product, we may keep in mind that additional to the cost that we have seen, that were the mere module costs, we have to add for contingencies and installation. which can be, according to literature and according to some discussion with industry, quite relevant. We have seen numbers in the range of 1.5 to 3 times from the bare module cost to the full installed cost. And that's also an area where several economies of scale and several implications can be derived. Now, looking at the levelized cost of hydrogen, what we can observe here, we have 6 bars grouped into 3 to the left and 3 to the right, which change by the assumed electricity supply cost. And the impact is quite dramatic. So whenever we are in a reasonably European cost scenario, 100 euros per megawatt hour electric, the electricity cost, so the OPEX of the plant is the majority, the blue part, with respect to the red part. Then when we switch to low-cost electricity, we are here using 40 euros per megawatt hour. That can be the LCOE of renewable production in some Southern European countries for solar. It can be close to wind generation in a very high wind location. There, the impact of electricity provision remains, let's say, in a similar order of magnitude, or at least not massively different from the dark red area that's a CAPEX area. And so when we enter a condition where the OPEX and the CAPEX are somehow compatible, the capacity factor becomes very important. So the difference between the bars among the group with the same electricity price refers to the capacity factor that's been assumed, and we see 95, 75, or 50%. And so here we are entering a little bit of a debate into how we can actually attain very high capacity factors using intermittent electricity, how we should play with the storage integration to make sure that we can adjust that. And when we look at our scaled up configurations, so when we look at larger stacks, larger hot boxes in our system with higher manufacturing rate, we can see that the target that we pose around 3.5 euros per kilogram can be largely satisfied once again when we are able to support inexpensive electricity supply. So the need for low-cost electricity remains a clear need for low-cost hydrogen. The configurations and the applications, so the kind of usage that we have for the plant also implies quite a lot. So we need to identify solutions where we can target a high capacity factor, which is also aligned with the somehow limited flexibility of solid oxide in adjusting quickly or fastly to intermittency or to frequent periods of on and off. We didn't stop on the economics, so as part of the OUTFOX project, we are also looking into the other kind of costs that we can sometimes hide. Among these, of course, the emissions. And so not just, of course, the emissions during the operation phase, which can be limited by using renewable electricity, but the life cycle emissions. So what happens in the manufacturing of our units. We are taking into consideration the industrial scale cells and stacks that are being developed within the OUTFOX that we have been discussing in the previous webinars. We are looking at the balance of plant configuration that we have simulated in Aspen. So we're using prospective simulated values. Taking into account an estimated 20 years balance of plant. And once again, you might have seen in the previous slides that there was some mention on the degradation rate. Degradation is quite important because it impacts the frequency of replacement. So it impacts the materials that are being used. And when we look into materials and emissions related to manufacturing, that becomes quite important. The estimates we are seeing here are some preliminary results because this task is still ongoing within OUTFOX, and we're focusing on the cases of Estonia and Finland as energy provision conditions because those are impacting us as related to the partners that are involved. Taking as a first case, 1% degradation per 1,000 hours of operation. We can see from the left chart how the electricity during operation is massively important. So the plant, as much as on the cost side was impacted by the electricity cost more than from the CAPEX, here is impacted by the electricity kind more than by what happens in the manufacturing of the system. So it's extremely important when we want to reduce the emissions that we are able to stick to renewable electricity. Even when we look at solar and wind, here we are not seeing zero emissions because we are looking at the life cycle also for the plant installation. So those are some embodied emissions. When we look at the degradation rate on the right-hand side, of course, we can see how the manufacturing might increase its relevance when we take into account very low emission electricity provision and we assume an extremely large, the fourth case with 5% degradation is quite beyond even the current status and for sure beyond the target. But it's important to acknowledge that the proportion between the elements might change. So in general, we want to share that the core element is in guaranteeing that the supply is green electricity. But of course, when we want to minimize emissions and impacts, it's important that we have a look also at the manufacturing phase. And it's quite interesting to see here, looking at the available data, here grouped for simplicity, that there are a few materials that are present in a moderately low amount, such as nickel in the constituents of the units, but these materials, due to their extraction and preparation phases, are quite impactful in terms of CO2 emissions. So we can see that the 14% presence of nickel in terms of total mass goes to a 40% of nickel among the emission generation. Similar goes for the stacks with lower numbers. Here, the main role is on metals, so stainless steel and interconnects that compose a large part of the mass and also a large part of the emissions. So nothing surprising. What's emerging, looking at the available information, is that current manufacturing is not fully industrialized yet. And so there is quite a significant impact of wastes, which can be tackled. So once again, scaling up the size of the plant as well as the manufacturing scale is quite relevant in order to improve the conditions, not just economically, but also environmentally. So we've showed how our analysis within the project allows to identify the importance of this scaling up effort on the core element, on the system configuration, and on the manufacturing scale. For sure, stack manufacturing is a primary area of development to improve costs and life cycle conditions. But then the other elements like the compressor and the high temperature recuperators can impact on the modularity, so on the cost and on the material balances. What we plan to do next is to look into the cases of intermittent electricity, so to develop some sequential hourly analysis where we can look at the combination of sizing and operation to check that capacity factor that we've seen is very important can be matched with the requirement for renewable supply. That's just a few references, and that's about all from my side. Thank you for the attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Paolo. So we do have some time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions for Paolo, please put those in the Q&A box. There is one question that came through already. In the CAPEX estimation, did you include EPC costs, financial arrangement costs, insurance, etc.?
Yeah, I mentioned briefly about that. So the numbers that were shown in the charts were referring to the bare module cost, which I call uninstalled cost. But there should be a note here in the baseline case. Of course, industries are pretty secretive into the exact value that they use to estimate those increases. But comparison with other projects, analysis in literature and so on, we have seen that numbers can be pretty important. So from 1.52%, so doubling what we see here, up to tripling that. So that numbers can be quite important. And for sure, it's complicated to assess what's the number for the first of kind and what's the number for the nth of a kind, because the first cases will have insurance and contingencies very high. Once the technology gets rolling, they can be shrinked pretty significantly.
Great, thank you very much. And the next question, what is the current status of the supply chain of materials for SOEC?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. So, as I mentioned, nickel is one of the most impactful, and it's one of the core elements. Nickel is not something, let's say, new to the industrial scale. So it's a supply chain that's already there, up and running. Of course, the scale and the directions might need some rearranging geographically to be sure that we can attain this. But we have one of the core advantages of the solid oxide electrolysis technologies compared to low temperature electrolysis is the reduction in use of precious material like platinum, iridium. So the supply chain is a little easier here.
Great, thank you. And next question, in the CAPEX estimation, which is the range studied for the megawatt per year?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. We start from the few tens and we go up to the gigawatt scale per year of manufacturing. So exactly in this slide, you can see the 4 bars span from the 10, 20 megawatt per year of manufacturing up to the gigawatt per year of manufacturing.
Okay. Great, thank you. And I had a question as well, if I may.
Sure.
So you mentioned, I believe at one point, that lowering the stack cost through the like scaling up the manufacturing, more economies of scale had quite a large impact. Did you also look at when you scale up the cell size? Because that's of course an important part of the OUTFOX project.
Sorry, can you rephrase, please?
So you mentioned before there was I guess actually the slide you're showing, the stack manufacturing rate, how when that increases, then the costs go down, of course. Have you also looked at when you make the cell size larger, and if how large of an impact that was? That's
No, not
in OUTFOX,
specifically.
that's a
We
big
try to
big.
we try to treat it as a lump. So it's about the scaling up of the entire cell plus stack configuration. But yeah, it could be interesting also to check. I mean, what we expect is a reduction in the waste when we get to the larger cells. But no, we don't have very precise data. OUTFOX is one of the first projects really targeting these very large cell areas per cell. So there's not much literature available, and even those who already played on that, it's not so easy to get the information from the industrial.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have more questions. I think we have time for maybe a couple more.
Okay.
So how to improve the working hours to make SOEC as the best option?
Oh, thank you for the question. That's actually an interesting trade-off. We have been investigating something about that as well. Working at higher current density typically implies that we can have a smaller system, so we can have a smaller cost because we have a more compact units with all the components. But at the same time, it increases the degradation. So we have to find a trade-off between working very safely at very low current densities, guaranteeing a very low degradation, and working at very high current density with improved productivity, but higher degradation. Of course, capacity manufacturing grow allows to have more information and identify what's the weak point. In general, extremely thin cells can also be an issue with faster degradation. So also there, performance can be improved when they are thinner, but that's why we also look at the system level and not simply at the punctual operation of the performance condition. So we try to find the trade-off to help that. And the final point is what we actually accept as the maximum degradation, so what we define as the replacement moment, because maybe it's worth accepting a decrease in performance for a little longer, but reducing the replacements, so reducing the costs in the optic of the overall total costs.
Great, thank you very much. So I would like to move on to the second speaker. Paolo,
Sure.
there's still
Thank you.
one more question for you in the chat. Please do keep your questions for Paolo coming, and he can type answers to them as we go
Yeah.
along.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Good. So with that, let me introduce our second speaker. So Dr. Srikanth S is a strategic technology leader at Shell, driving innovation in the global energy transition. He holds a PhD in electrochemical process engineering and brings more than a decade of hands-on experience in green hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, and low-carbon systems. So we're very happy to have him here today to share Shell's perspective on commercializing green hydrogen and the technology and market pathways needed towards low-carbon solutions. So Srikanth, the floor is yours.
Just want to check if you can hear me well, and
Yep,
let me see if I can share the screen. Okay. Are you able to see the screen?
It's just loading. Yep, it's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay, that's good. All right, cool. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and then good morning for the folks in Europe. I'm based out of India, so it's more this afternoon time for me. Good. I'm happy to give a talk today in the webinar about the low carbon hydrogen technology commercialization and the technology deployment and what requires in scaling up of this technology in green hydrogen, but also how critical technology development and technology improvements are required for this to achieve this green hydrogen ambition. So briefly, before I go, I will have to share this cautionary note, which states that basically it's a legal statement which says don't buy any shares of Shell based on the presentation I give you today. And also, and yeah, that's just basically summarizing this entire paragraph. Good. Why are we looking at? So Shell has a ambition program in terms of where we're looking at net zero emissions by 2050 and aiming to be doing that by focusing on areas where we are competitive at, and targeting those ambitions requires different range of solutions where hydrogen fits in one of the portfolio as one of the solution matrix that we are looking at. So this is where we intend to go. Yeah, this is where we are looking at. So we are currently looking to have liquefied products, but going towards building the energy system of the future, where then you need to look at low carbon molecules, decarbonization of industry, and also a range of solutions that we are looking at. And for some of these, especially the low carbon molecules and industrial decarbonization, hydrogen is a critical vector that we all know, and that requires different solutions to make it affordable, competitive, and eventually a workable solution in the space. So we're looking at hydrogen more from an industry for hard to abate use cases, the refineries and chemical industries such as ammonia, fertilizer industry, potentially also in the transportation sector, especially where you require higher energy densities, where such as sustainable aviation fuels and to some extent marine aspect, but also other industries like steel industry, which has heavy energy use, where you have to replace coal and other fossil fuels and have more cleaner solutions that are there. But also doing that also requires quite some work on technology development and activities on the upstream of the hydrogen production facility that makes to have a more enabled renewable energy based system. So you need to also look at grid and integration aspect of it, the renewable grid aspect of it, and also in terms of how do you transport the electrons to the production side or the end use cases, either directly to industry or in a vector of hydrogen. So that brings into the topic of hydrogen. So we have a wide range of hydrogen projects that some of you might be aware of in the call. But just to give you an overview of the current portfolio of operations that we have in the hydrogen space. But what is of more interest for, at least, I guess, mostly for our community looking at low carbon hydrogens is mostly the projects that we are heavily involved in. That's also been also been public, is also the two projects, the Holland Hydrogen one, which is a 200 megawatt green hydrogen facility that we are building in the port of Rotterdam, where we're using the wind energy, offshore wind coming from the north of Netherlands, feeding the electrolyzer. Similarly, on a similar line, and this is also similar to the other project that we are doing, that's in Germany, where we're building a 100 megawatt PEM based, what we call the Refine 2 in an industrial sector, which is also feeding, looking at, these are projects in execution, and these are projects that looking to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors or refinery applications such as these. I'll go a bit more detail into some of the projects that details into these projects and also what we're doing a bit more further to help the cost reduction and through technology developments and deployment activities, and what we are looking for in the OUTFOX, within the context of the OUTFOX projects. Right. So that leads to the slide changes. Right. So we started off with a small project in Germany, which is a defined one, where we built a 10 megawatt PEM electrolyzer in a brownfield environment. This is an operating unit. That's the first electrolyzer that we built and started operated in the part of a European Union, supported by European Union project, which also gave us the confidence to go further in the bigger one to scale it up to 100 megawatt Refine 2, which is currently in construction phase. And it's also a European Union project. It's expected to do 44 TPD of hydrogen to partially decarbonize the operations, decarbonize the energy projects, such as products such as transportation fuels that are produced from a refinery in Rhineland. And this could also be in long term, when the other infrastructures are in place, could also be potentially used to directly supply to lower industrial emissions in the region, as well as the customer demand evolves in and around Germany for hydrogen. The other one was a bit more landmark project, is the biggest one that we are being involved in, which is a 200 megawatt alkaline electrolyzer in the port of Rotterdam, which is relying on a wind energy of 759 megawatts coming from the north, the Holland Coast North wind project. And the hydrogen is to be initially used at the Pernis refinery, with a possible future application in heavy duty trucking sector. But as you can see, the current industrialization of the hydrogen and getting to scale relies on more of captive use, decarbonizing the industrial application, especially the refineries and the hard-to-abate sector. As this market evolves, as hydrogen evolves and the cost reduces, we see naturally growing out other potential market developing as the cost reduces. But to do that, to get the cost down, we need technology development across the board, which is where I am heavily involved in, and my team is largely working on, and now is also what we're doing in the context of the OUTFOX project. So we are looking at technologies at Shell. We're looking at technologies across the block of green hydrogen production, but where we are more interested and focused on is in this space, where we're looking not just on the electrochemistry, on the stack development and stack technologies and next generation technologies, but also upstream of the stacks, which is a very critical part of renewable integration in terms of how do you bring these electrons to the electrolyzer and to the site where you want to produce the molecules, and also process integration. How are you purifying it? How do you transport it? How do you make it compatible if you're integrating with a downstream process? How do you integrate it that can then safely operate? And one of the biggest aspects that we have been focusing on in Shell quite heavily is the HSSE of the core processes, including the electrolyzer, especially when you have hydrogen and oxygen. There's a certain safety risk, but also electrical hazards. So managing that and how do you safely operate at scale is where a huge part of our R&D effort is there. Now, across this board, one of the key aspects that we are also looking with the key fundamental driver that we want is how can we get the cost down of the final product. And in one area that we are heavily looking at is the core technology, looking at next generation electrolyzer technologies. right? And in terms of technology demonstration across the value chain, we have a wide range of activities, and some of the major ones that are shown here is what we're doing. And for example, the project one, which I initially spoke about, is the EnergyNet project, which is more focusing on the renewable integration. How can we get the electrons to the electrolyzer as cheaply as possible? So that is what we're looking in this project. Then you also have the second one, which is more focused on the second part of the value chain, which is a core technology, where we have a 1 megawatt high temperature SOEC demonstration unit in Bangalore at a Shell Technology Center to have more operation and learning and experience on the technology and demonstrating the technology's capabilities. We are also in the low temperature space. We also have more analysis on our unit in Amsterdam, where we're studying more in terms of life cycle assessment and performance under renewable conditions, impact of intermittent operations on lifetime, and how does it impact our commercial scale plants, especially if you have to operate with wind or solar intermittency. But also more, this is the other part which I focus on, how could you improve the safeguarding and the state of the health monitoring of the electrolyzer technology itself, which is very critical to the lifetime performance, but also to the safety of the asset, which is a very key aspect if you really have to get green hydrogen plants at scale running safely, and also having high availability of the plants. And last but not least, we're also looking at in concepts where we can do 24 power supply with baseload power hub, where we have an electrolyzer coupled with battery and a fuel cell, working closely with an offshore wind turbine system to see how can we demonstrate how can we use these technologies to improve 24/7 green energy supply. Yeah, so with that, so where the more focus on the SOEC, that is where we are doing in OUTFOX. So one of the key aspects we are looking at is the high temperature electrolyzer technology. So one of the pilots work we have that we have been heavily involved in and active on is the pilot in Bangalore, which is the 1 megawatt pilot here in our technology hub in Bangalore, where I'm currently based out, where we're de-risking the metal-supported SOEC technology, more focused on getting the cost down, improving the lifetime of operations, having to demonstrating efficiency and performance and lifetime performance as well. And this is also what we are looking also into the OUTFOX project, where Paolo mentioned in his earlier talk in terms of how can we get the cost down, what are the levers we have to get the cost down, and especially when we are looking at the use cases of hydrogen, which are currently the initial applications are more to the hard-to-abate sector, the ammonia industry, the refinery, and industrial applications, then SOEC technology becomes a very interesting tool to have in the portfolio because of the heat integrated possibility, which what Paolo showed in us, where the impact of heat integration helps in the efficiency, reducing the specific energy consumption of producing the hydrogen to lower 40s or even below 40 kilowatt hour per kg of hydrogen, which has a huge impact on the LCOH because power cost has a significant impact on the LCOH. But efficiency also has an impact on the total cost because one part of the cost of a plant is the electrolyzer technology, which is what Paolo showed. But if you look at the total cost of a plant, there are a lot of others aspect of it. The electrical infrastructure, the transformer, the cooling systems, the plot space, etc. So higher efficiency also has indirect impact on the CAPEX as well. So having a highly efficient electrolyzer, it helps reduce the OPEX, but also reduce the total installed cost of a plant per kg of hydrogen that you want to produce. So that is why that's a key interest for us in the SOEC technology, and that's also what we're keenly looking at in the OUTFOX in terms of why we see a value in the OUTFOX project is primarily on how can increasing the cell area, increasing power density, and increasing the module building blocks to get to scale. So throughout currently in industry, we see this technology being demonstrated at a megawatt scale, but I think the next step is to how to get it to from a single digit megawatt scale to double digit and eventually commercial scale deployment in order to realize the potential and the value of this technology in a commercial space. Yeah, that's where I would stop for today and happy to have any questions for further discussion.
Great, thank you very much. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A. I just have one to maybe get things kicked off. So what does Shell see as the most important focus area to de-risk to enable large-scale production?
I think we need to have more proof points in terms of getting this technology operated. And this is where these initial large-scale plants come in, even if it's for low-temperature electrolysis like alkaline and PEM, which are a bit more proven than the new technologies such as SOEC. Eventually, for these kind of low-temperature technologies are at least more at a commercial scale, needs to demonstrate stable operation at life, need to show that they are able to translate the benefits in commercial operations as well. For the new technologies, especially for promising technologies like SOEC, the key thing is demonstrate lifetime of the efficiency promise, demonstrate that they're able to work robust, and also demonstrate scalability. And this is the important part. Now, a lot of technologies we have seen have shown fantastic promise at the lab scale, at the pilot phase, but have struggled to scale up. Now, I think where we see SOEC technology is currently at that space where we have enough pilot and a single megawatt scale proof points, but then the roadmap towards commercial scale deployment. How are we going to get there? How do we scale this up while also getting the cost down, improving industrialization, quality assurance in manufacturing, which is very important, especially there are a lot of plastic stacks which are produced in volume. So you have uniform quality, ensuring robust supply chain. All this needs to be done. So this is now entering into de-risking areas, which is a bit more beyond technology, but also on the other aspects of practical aspects of deploying it at a commercial scale. So that is what is required. I think that's the direction we need to head to translate these proof points, these economic potentials into commercial reality.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Great. There's more questions coming in. So can you say anything about how the series electrolyzer is working?
I think we'll have to wait a bit more in terms of for us to say. We have just started operational and we are still in the learning process. And eventually, I think in the upcoming months or years, there'll be a bit more information on that we can share on how the systems work.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, and I think maybe this was a follow-on from that question. You're saying what he means is, so people always say that the SOEC stacks are fragile. Series does have the metal supported system. Do they also encounter problems due to this?
I think many experts on the call can also correct me if I'm not correct, but I would generally contest that SOEC technologies are not fragile. They are robust if you're operating within their operation window. And if you've designed a system around well for the stack, these stacks are robust. Even the traditional electrolyte supported stacks or the anode supported or the electrode supported stacks are also robust enough. All right. Now, the question is, what is the temperature range you want to operate at? Whether you're okay with operating at 800 degrees or 600 degrees or 550 degrees, that's a different thing. And what benefits that gives in terms of overall cost, performance, and lifetime. So that's a different angle and as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. And how many operation hours have you accumulated with the 1 megawatt demonstrators? What is the return of experience on the electrolyzer and on the auxiliary systems, and where are their bottlenecks?
So I think in terms of operational, it was communicated end of last year, beginning of the year, that we started the commissioning process and the unit is commissioned. So it is only new and we are only in the early phase of the operation phase. So we have produced significant amount of hydrogen already, but we are still learning this, analyzing the data and learning jointly with Ceres in terms of how it works and what's performance. But what we can share is in terms of the operation aspect is just beyond the core electrolyzer technology, and you need to look at the operation challenges in terms of the overall plant perspective, especially when we are talking about steam, the steam generation system, making sure the steam is on spec, which is a very critical aspect, and all the other non-electrolyzer related parts are also critical, and make sure that does not impact your overall performance of the technology. Right. So I think we need to be really careful in terms of how to talk about technology performance, and we need to look at it from a plant context, whether the performance was because of the technology or something else going on in the plant, And especially when you're talking about SOEC technology, but you want to put it in an industrial context, and if you want to use the steam or heat available in the industrial context, then it has a different quality specs that you don't have in the lab scale. Now that is a very critical step, and this is what we intend to see in terms of how can we use in the real operating environment, how this technology performs. And yeah, we'll have to wait before we can communicate anything certain, because we need to get more operation hours under the belt.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. And based on your experience, what do you think the stack cost of a series plant will be around 2030?
I don't have a projection of what series cost is. It depends on a lot of other things. But as Paolo showed in his graphs earlier, it depends on the capacity of manufacturing at scale, supply chain, etc. Right? So, and that goes whether it's series or Elcogen or Solidera or Topso, whoever it is, in terms of how do you get to industrial scale manufacturing, and that is the critical factor in the cost, plant technology and the cost. We would like to see the cost, whether it's series or Elcogen or whoever it is, to get the cost down to the EU target that has been put out in the SRIA towards the $500 to $600 per kilowatt. If you can get there, then I think it's a wonderful place to be in. Who gets there and how they get there, it's up to the technology OEMs to demonstrate it and get there eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thank you. And if any of the other panelists want to jump in and comment on these questions, yeah, please do so as well. Good. So another question: Are you experiencing problems with SOEC and the integration with the downstream processes, pressure balances, other constraints, etc.?
I think this is a general electrolyzer aspect, whether it's SOEC or alkaline or PEM. Downstream integration, depending on the context and where we are using it and how you are operating, has a huge impact on your overall design. So there's not a generalized that SOEC has this problem, alkaline has this problem, and all that stuff. One thing I would say, a low pressure is definitely an interesting technical challenge, and I think one of the learnings, at least we can already start communicating, that we can share, and is also widely accepted in the SOEC industry, is if we can get some more pressurized operation, where the hydrogen is not close to atmosphere, but getting to pressurized operation benefits the overall compressor integration aspect and the cost of the compressor, which is also what, if you see Paolo's LC8 cost, you can see compressor as cost is a significant part there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Great.
the other part I said is the steam integration, then you get steam on quality.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's also for alkaline and PEM, you need to get like water quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thank you. Next question: can you comment on the CAPEX reduction cost approach of series, working as a licensor and using manufacturers which are specialized in the manufacturing?
That unfortunately I can't comment on. That's more of a different business strategy of different OEMs. So
fair enough.
For us is more that it doesn't matter how they get there, if they can get the cost to that $600, $500 per kilowatt benchmark as stated in the EU roadmap, then we are happy. Different ways to approach it. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, great, thank you very much. Good. I don't see any other questions coming through for now. If anything comes up, please again feel free still to put those in the chat. But Srikanth, thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. Then with that, I will introduce our third and final speaker. Who's also a guest speaker today. So we're very happy that he's here. So Grzegorz Pawelec is Director of Market Intelligence at, at Hydrogen Europe, where he leads market analysis, forecasting, and competitive insight to inform commercial strategy and investment decisions in the low carbon energy sector. He specializes in translating data into actionable guidance on demand trajectories, pricing, supply chain readiness, and policy impacts to help industry and investors navigate the energy transition. So we feel very privileged that we have him here today to outline the market outlook and key indicators shaping the commercial pathway for solid oxide electrolysis and hydrogen deployment. So great, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Erin, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Let me just share the screen quickly. Hope you can all see it. So indeed, I would focus on, because what we already heard from Shah about the economics and the commercial deployment and from the technology side, so I will focus more on the regulatory perspective. So what are the key bottlenecks that are maybe holding the technology and the sector overall back a little bit from realizing the potential that and the ambition that we hoped that it could get to. Before I go to that, maybe a slight short introduction to Hydrogen Europe, because as you mentioned, we are not involved directly in the project, so maybe not everyone knows who we are. So we are an industry association, European industry association that now we have more than 600 members. And representing the full hydrogen value chain, but maybe not the full hydrogen value chain. It does exclude the gray hydrogen part from what we represent. So we really focus on using hydrogen as a decarbonization vector. So that's our focus, looking both at the production of hydrogen, and that's where the solid oxide technology comes into it, through distribution of hydrogen and use of hydrogen in various industry applications. So we are, I think, quite proud of the fact that we do indeed have members representing the whole value chain from start to finish. And having said that, if my presentation today will not touch everything, we are also organizing a Hydrogen Week end of October this year, with an expo. So you're all invited to join us there. And if the regulatory issues are of interest to any of you, that's probably the place to be and to discuss it. So with that, a bit of self-promotion out of the way, let me dive into the topic. But before I go into various points, I think what's important to clear is that to have a bit of a broader view on the regulatory issues, because the solid oxide technology does not exist in a vacuum. It was also, as Shell mentioned, some of the issues are the same as for other low temperature electrolysis. Some issues are kind of applying to the whole hydrogen sector as a whole. So we have a number of topics that are kind of crucial to the deployment of solid oxide and crucial to the technology itself, but apply to the overall sector, right? And there we can mention elements like unlocking demand for the hydrogen or products made from green hydrogen, like for green steel, for ammonia, and so forth. Because without that, there'll be very little reason to deploy the solid oxide electrolyzers. We need to have the infrastructure to develop, to deliver hydrogen to off-takers. We are now also waiting for the implementation of the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, in member states, which are already more than a year. Okay, maybe not more than a year, because the deadline passed in May last year, but we are slowly approaching 1 year after the deadline has passed, and many member states still haven't implemented the Renewable Energy Directive. And that's, I think, especially important for solid oxide technology, as the part that is lagging mostly is the implementation of the directive in the industrial applications, where the solid oxide has some clear advantages, right? So there are a number of high-level or regulatory issues that apply to the whole sector, and within those, you could also mention some that are relevant for other electrolyzers as well. So the infamous RFMBO delegated acts, which I will touch upon a little bit more in detail. But there is also a number of specific issues that are concerning the SOEC technology. So I will try to touch a little bit on all of those issues that are mentioned on the slide, at least all of the categories of issues that are mentioned on the slide. But I think it's because of time and because of how varied the different regulatory aspects are, I won't be able to go into very detail of every of those elements. So, but just to keep in mind, right, that there is much more to it than those specific issues that might concern the solid oxide technology. But indeed, going into the technology itself or into the solid oxide sphere, I think the first element that needs to be unlocked on a regulatory level, on a policy level, is indeed the de-risking. That's something that also Shell mentioned, is that we do have a lot of experience with the technology on a lab scale or maybe small pilot scale deployment. But when it comes to large scale industrial deployment, there is still a gap that needs to be bridged, right? So when it comes to the various risks that are related to this kind of large scale deployment, we need to look at each of those risks kind of in isolation and try to find a tool that would allow us to address it, right? So when it comes to the technology itself, so the CAPEX element and the stacks deployment of and development of stacks, there we have good instruments that are already ongoing, which is the Clean Hydrogen Partnerships, which is, for example, funding also this project, and that needs to continue, right? We are slowly approaching the end of the current financial framework and the lifetime of the current partnership as well, and so very soon a decision needs to be made how to continue the research and development activities and funding of those activities going forward to the next financial framework. And it's still not a given that the next partnership will be there. That's something that we advocate, and we still certainly see a need to keep the R&D funding strong. Maybe the alkaline technology might not always kind of need it, but there are all emerging technologies, and solid oxide is one of those that still would benefit significantly from further development and further funding. Having said that, though, also following what was mentioned by Shell, I think there is now, a growing need to fund larger scale deployment. So when it comes to the budgets that Clean Hydrogen Partnership has for the projects, those are good to do a research project, but those are the budget for an individual project is not high enough to be able to fund through 10 million euro, for example, or 20 million euro even to fund a industry scale pilot project. For that, we need different sets of tools, right? So the partnership can develop technology to a TRL 6, maybe 5, 6, but the industry, in order to deploy those technologies, would probably expect 8 or 9 to reduce the risk, and there is a need to have a tool that we would be able to use to bridge that gap. We have already the Innovation Fund pilot funding instrument that is theoretically for that particular reason there, right? To further deploy lower TRL projects with a funding instrument of a budget of 50 million euros. So that should theoretically be there, but we need more of those type of funding instruments to be able to indeed show the real life implementation and to prove the degradation rates, prove the performance of these technologies in real life environment. And that's something that we also need a good funding tool that will be able to do that, right? Because again, the typical R&D instruments under Horizon Europe that we have kind of are not sufficient for that. The budget is just too low to be able to fund a real life investment. And when you go to the Hydrogen Bank or Innovation Fund, the general call there, because of the funding is extremely competitive sphere to get the funding, starting with a unproven technology or a technology maybe that's not unproven but still lacks a little bit of data, and there is still some technology risk for the developers. I do think there is a gap to be bridged there for solid oxide. And then still sticking on the technology side, there is also, I think, a growing realization that we need to also protect European technologies and European technology manufacturers. We see some action in that direction from the Hydrogen Bank, which does put in place some made in Europe requirements. But I would just like to point out that it's not only about the protecting technology itself, right? We have seen, for example, in the recent Industrial Accelerator Act, that the previous leaks of that document did have a requirement that those clean products, like clean steel, produced as kind of as a response to the requirements of that regulation. In previous draft, it would had to be not only clean but also made in Europe or produced in Europe. Those requirements are now gone, and we think that this is a mistake, because really focusing also on European made, and especially for those emerging technologies where there is a huge risk that the developers will be outcompeted for different technologies, but much cheaply produced in China, for example. The risk is really there, and we need to try to combat that. But that's only just one part, right? The technology deployment and the stack development and so forth. But there are multiple other risks as well, and one of it would be the financial risks. There we see the sustainable finance taxonomy as a kind of key tool that was supposed to help out channeling the investments into the clean tech development and also into deployment of hydrogen. However, we see that it's not designed in certain areas in a way that is supporting that objective. A couple of examples. For example, when it comes to the business activity about developing technologies for production of hydrogen, the way that the criteria is framed or is currently worded would require the electrolyzer manufacturer to provide a proof to auditor that the electrolyzer themselves are then deployed later by the customer in a way that would allow the production of clean hydrogen. And from a developer point of view, and especially if you are developing just components of an electrolyzer, that's an extremely challenging to do. So that creates unnecessary additional barriers for developers, and that kind of then makes it very difficult for pure hydrogen investment funds to be able to engage in funding those kind of technologies and those kind of companies that develop those technologies, because there is a risk that they might not be able to prove full taxonomy alignment later on. So there are various elements also in that sphere that needs to be addressed, and that goes also beyond just the electrolyzers themselves, because we see, for example, I know when it comes to CO2 infrastructure, transport infrastructure, the taxonomy currently only recognizes the CO2 transporting infrastructure if that CO2 is transported for permanent storage, but not, for example, if it's transported for CCU. So we're looking from a point of view that solid oxide electrolyzers have a great potential on the market, for example, for ESAF production with co-electrolysis of steam and CO2. Not recognizing that the CO2 transport infrastructure that would be needed for those projects to be deployed, not recognizing it as taxonomy aligned, also creates unnecessary risk, and that kind of limits or makes it difficult for some investors to invest in this kind of project. So there are some elements that also there need to be addressed in the future. What we see is also some very good signs, because just for your information, I mean, only I think 2 weeks ago, the Commission has opened a public consultation for a revision of the taxonomy, and some of these elements that I have just mentioned are already being addressed there. So hopefully those bottlenecks will be removed soon, but they are for now still there. Then there is a whole chunk of risks that are, let's say, exist at the operational level. And that also was mentioned before, is we do not have yet experience from lifetime performance of those solid oxide stacks. Right? Okay, at lab level, yes, at pilot level, yes, but in real deployment and long-term life cycle performance, that data is not yet available, and that obviously creates unnecessary risk again for the project developers, and also increases CAPEX, because it often is the case that the developer of a project requires performance guarantees from the OEMs, from the electrolyzer suppliers, And if themselves do not have that lifetime kind of data and experience that they can use to provide that assurances and guarantees, then obviously they need to have an insurance and they need to protect themselves financially from potential risks. And that all also increases the cost, right, of the EPC, of the kind of outside of stack development costs, all those other elements. And this is something that we feel should be addressed, and that's something that we work on for the next, again, multi-annual financial framework to maybe leverage the EIB for that case, which is supposed to be the climate bank of Europe, to be able to provide those kind of guarantees for project developers or for OEMs. We are not even talking about funding, so not money itself, but just be able to guarantee the performance of these new technologies in a way to take away that technology risk for those first of a kind projects. Obviously, it's something that is really needed for those first of a kind, maybe second of a kind, and at some point will not be needed anymore. But I mean, to kickstart the market, we do feel that those kind of de-risking tools would be very beneficial for the deployment of those new technologies. There is obviously much more that can be done on this operational level to de-risk a little bit the operation, and that also involves de-risking long-term PPAs. It's not specific to the solid oxide technology by any means. It's more general to the electrolyzers as a whole, but we do see that there is a problem, especially for first of a kind projects and that are sometimes deployed as in a form of special purpose vehicles, that they have also issues contracting or getting a long-term PPA in place, because those PPAs, in order to be bankable, also need to have they need to be signed with a company with good credit rating, for example, and that's something that might not always be possible. So there are a lot of elements that indeed institutions like AIB can help us cover. Again, not specifically to solid oxide, but I think extremely important for the sector as a whole. And the same goes for the other two elements which are mentioned on the operational element, is that facilitating grid access. That's something that we extremely see as getting more and more important, especially with the competition with data centers for grid access. That is only going to get stronger in the coming years. We need to make sure that the deployment of those multi-hundred megawatt plants that would be needed for ammonia plants, steel plant, and so forth, is getting preferential access to the grid, because without that might also not be able to deploy those large-scale projects. Obviously, we would want at some point that some of those electrolyzers would be built more off-grid and injecting hydrogen, or kind of where the renewables are, injecting hydrogen into the pipelines and not producing directly, taking electricity from the grid. However, that first requires infrastructure to be first in place, which it's not. And the second, especially for solid oxide technologies, which do benefit, that was also mentioned, from heat integration, for example, it makes sense to locate those type of installations in the industrial clusters where the potential of using waste heat is. But then access to the grid also can become a bottleneck very quickly. So that's also something that we work on. And then maybe last point when it comes to those elements that need to be tackled is also the indirect cost compensation. I mean, that something that everyone knows, that electricity is the biggest cost factor in deployment of electrolysis in general. It's no different for a solid oxide. And then tools like the indirect cost compensation that are already deployed in some countries, like Germany is one example. Extending those tools beyond 2030, which is currently the cutoff date for all of them that are existing, would be extremely important, right? So that you have the industrial off-takers who would be deploying the technology, be shielded from the impact of the ETS, indirect ETS costs of carbon costs in the electricity that they purchase to operate the electrolyzer, and then it would be then shielded from those costs, not to pay double basically for the ETS. And those instruments are already in place. However, they all currently end in 2030, and they should certainly be extended beyond that. And then the last element, which are the regulatory risks. I already briefly mentioned about the three refuel aviation when it comes to key regulatory files that are needed, and they need to be implemented and stay there, not being constantly reopened, revised, and put into question. And then also the revision of the RFMBOs. But those points I will maybe go a little bit deeper on the next slide. Yeah, because the RFMBO delegated acts are indeed a huge problem for the deployment or commercialization of electrolysis. And that's not only solid oxide, but I do think that for solid oxide technologies, those delegated acts as they are now are extremely are even more damaging than for low temperature electrolysis. And why is that? First of all, I mean, we heard from both Paolo and Shell that being able to use the, do heat integration with the existing, maybe using waste heat from some industrial installation already, greatly improves the energy efficiency of the installation, and then reduces the cost, both CAPEX, because you need a smaller plant for the same amount of hydrogen, and also the operating costs. However, the RFMBO delegated acts, as they are now, have somewhat of a create somewhat of a this incentive to for use of that waste heat, and that's because if that waste heat or that steam was initially produced in some process that still used fossil fuels to create that steam, then the hydrogen that is going to be produced with combination of that heat and electricity input would not be 100% RFMBO anymore. And that's obviously an issue. So we have been always advocating that when it comes to use of waste inputs that otherwise would have been left unused, that should not impact the renewable character of the fuel itself. So you should not get a fossil hydrogen out of it. It should still be fully renewable if the electricity used is fully renewable. However, that's not always the interpretation from the certification bodies to the project. So that's something that certainly should be addressed, because again, I fully agree and I fully recognize that being able to do the heat integration could have huge benefits for the LCOH and should be incentivized, right? We have all the energy efficiency first principles, so we should try to incentivize operating those plants at the highest possible energy efficiency, and not create rules that are basically making that more difficult than it needs to be. Then there are a number of elements which are equally important for all electrolyzers, but I think for solid oxide also significantly, because they are kind of more impactful for decarbonization of energy-intensive industry. So large industrial sites, which would need hundreds of megawatts of electrolysis to decarbonize, and then certain elements like the requirements of using fully additional renewable sources that cannot be subsidized, right? Because those two elements go together, is creating, we see already, huge headaches, especially since when we look at where the energy-intensive industries who could be decarbonized using hydrogen are located currently in Europe. That's Netherlands, that's Germany, that is Poland. So none of those countries are specifically or well-placed to be producing low-cost hydrogen, or that are maybe suffering from an abundance of renewables also, right? In case of Poland, all the renewables that are being built now, I mean, they predominantly going to decarbonize the power grid, and there is scarcity of new renewables going online on the market. And most of the new renewables that go on the market are subsidized through contracts for difference or other tools. Like the entire new offshore wind being built in Poland is going to be receiving subsidies, which automatically renders it completely useless to produce green hydrogen, right? So those elements are extremely also important for deployment of solid oxide technologies, because if there is not enough renewables to support that, and especially for large-scale industrial applications where there is a lot of power needed, that creates a big headache. And kind of what's very linked to that is also the requirement of temporal correlation. So most of you would probably know that currently there is a monthly temporal correlation requirement, so that the electricity consumed and production of and consumption of electricity needs to be enclosed within the same calendar month. But starting from 2030, that will go into hourly temporal correlation. And again, especially for energy-intensive industries, that is proving a problem. I know now that the solid oxide technology, it's a bit of a myth that it cannot operate flexibly, because there is a bit of flexibility possibility there. However, if the off-taker cannot live with that because the off-taker needs hydrogen 24/7, that doesn't change much in terms of how big of an issue that hourly temporal correlation requirement is, right? And especially again for those energy-intensive industries, which would need hydrogen 24/7. Again, maybe in the future we'll be able to source hydrogen from the backbone with integrated storage and so forth, but especially in the ramp-up phase of the hydrogen market where the infrastructure is not yet there, and especially for solid oxide technologies, which would benefit from the integration within an industrial site to be able to use that heat that is there, going from monthly to an hourly correlation will be a huge problem. And related to that is also the inability to use other sources than renewable, right? Currently, we have a framework in place that only recognizes that electricity can either be fully renewable or grid electricity. There is no third option available. So if you would like to deal with that hourly correlation, for example, by signing a PPA with a nuclear power plant, that's not going to be any good because nuclear PPAs are not recognized within the framework. So, just to give a couple of elements, and I think all of them are extremely important. And again, I view personally the delegated acts as they are as one of the really key bottlenecks in the deployment of the technologies at a wider scale. And I do think that specifically for solid oxide, there are some provisions that make it especially damaging to the kind of potential of that technology to going forward. So that's it. And then maybe a couple of last slides, because I mentioned at the very beginning that there are some issues or regulatory bottlenecks that need to be addressed, that are more specific to the electrolysis and solid oxide. But there is also a number of elements which we need to address urgently that go beyond that. Okay, I mentioned already the regulatory framework with the RFMBO and low carbon delegated acts being very restrictive, but there is more to it than that, right? We have the RED III transposition delays that are really holding down investments. We could have a lot more FIDs and a lot of more deployment if we had a much more clarity on what various member states are planning to do in terms of RED III implementation. When it comes to transport, that is somehow progressing. There are good movements. half of member states either have or have drafts of implementation of those regulations. But when it comes to industrial implementation, there is precious little. Just a handful of countries have implemented it, and those that have, in many cases, do it in a very disappointing way. So there is also a clear push needed there. It's again not only for electrolysis, but especially for industrial applications that is really key, so that this national transposition is continues. And then already I also mentioned the slow buildup of infrastructure. That's something that is extremely needed. Maybe not for solid oxide, because again I would expect those to be integrated with the industrial side and not as much depend on hydrogen infrastructure to deploy that hydrogen, but for the wider market development, that's extremely extremely needed and something that is blocking also the developments. And then maybe last point, because for funding I already mentioned a lot, but when it comes to unlocking demand, we have a number of mandatory quotas already in place, but usually those are designed in a way that we are creating an obligation on industry or fuel suppliers to decarbonize using hydrogen. And that is obviously one way of doing it. And if the obligations are not high, then that can be also a very good way of doing it. But when we talk about relatively high obligations, like the 42% mandate in industry, then we need to also realize that just translating that mandate into industry obligation would create a risk of carbon leakage. So we need to ensure that there is demand also for those products that are made with green hydrogen. So the demand for clean steel, demand for clean fertilizers. For steel, we already see there is a lot of movement in that sphere. So we have a proposal to introduce a CO2 credit for car OEMs that would be producing cars and vehicles using clean steel. We have now in the Industrial Accelerator Act a provision that would aim to create a demand for clean steel also using the public procurement tool. However, for some other sectors, it's much more challenging, and fertilizers is one of those where we don't yet see any movement and willingness from the point of policymakers to create a demand for those clean products. And with the recent proposal to maybe retrospectively freeze the CBAM application for fertilizers, that is not helping even further. But just not to finish on such a negative note, because I was listing a lot of issues and barriers, just maybe a slight outlook of what we see, those various regulations that we do have in place could create in terms of demand for hydrogen going with a perspective of 2030. So in total, what we see currently is close to 2.8 million tons of hydrogen demand that would be stimulated through various regulatory files. So as I said, the transport part, which is the use of hydrogen in refineries, like the Refinet project, for example, like Holland Hydrogen 1 project that were presented, that is progressing relatively well. But when it comes to industry and maritime sector, there I think a bit of hiccups, and there are some doubts whether those volumes will be achievable in that amount by 2030, because the amount of investment that we see is not yet at the scale that would give much optimism into how much of those 1.3 million tons of industry will be actually seeing by 2030. But still, we do think that this total, it's quite an optimistic figure, and as I said, a lot of it will have to go to industry. And in that particular space, when it comes to industry application, when it comes to e-fuels for maritime, when it comes to e-fuels for aviation, those are the elements where indeed solid oxide can realize huge potential. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. A very, very interesting presentation. And judging by the questions I see coming through, I think that's topics that could be discussed on extensively. It's probably a whole nother webinar in itself. We are out of time, but Greg, are you available to stay on to answer some of the questions still?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So good. So let me just, we will stay on to answer questions. But if anybody needs to leave, I would just like to say thank you very much to the speakers. It's very appreciated, your time and the presentations. And also for those attending, we will be making the recording available. So please keep an eye on our socials and our website. For that, I will just share quickly so you have the website in front of you. There will be a follow-up email as well, so you can stay in touch as far as that goes. Good. So yeah, let's jump to some questions because it's quite an interesting topic. So the first one says renewable electricity is relatively expensive in the EU, and SOEC is more efficient compared to low temperature systems. CAPEX of all types of systems will be more or less the same in 2030 to 2050. So how do you think low temperature systems, which are deployed now in the EU, can be competitive with future SOEC systems?
Well, again, a lot depends on the regulatory framework, as I mentioned, because if you have a bit of a bottleneck that effectively prevents the use of heat, because it would then render part of the hydrogen non-renewable, that could create a problem, because that non-renewable hydrogen you will not be able to sell for the same green premium as the renewable part, and that can provide a bit of a problem, because if you don't have the same premium and if you need to sell part of that hydrogen as gray or low carbon and cannot get the same green premium on it, then that could create a problem. But I do agree that solid oxide going forward, if the CAPEX really goes down and the degradation rates, we can prove that they are reasonably, and because there is indeed a lot of risk on the market that maybe the degradation rate or the kind of replacement of those stacks will have to be done often. If that can be proven not to be the case, then I fully agree that solid oxide temperature, high temperature electrolysis can be a winner. But I don't see a reason why to look how to low temperature electrolysis can be competitive. I would imagine just lower CAPEX could help, but other than that, I don't see a reason why solid oxide cannot be the best and the go-to technology going forward.
Great, thank you. Next question. It says, in my view, there's too much attention for financing cost regulations. If you look at the H2 production cost price, these influence the number behind the comma. The number before the comma is due to OPEX. Taking this into account, do you see a future for SOEC and low temperature systems in the EU besides the Iberian Peninsula and Nordics?
Well, yes, I do. And I also disagree that it's just above the comma. Okay, electricity and energy is by far the biggest part, right? But the CAPEX is still important. And part of the CAPEX is also inflated, as was mentioned by Paolo, 2 to 3 times sometimes for the EPC and all those elements and cost integration. And a lot of that can be supported through funding instruments. And that doesn't have to be always money. That can also be some de-risking instruments, and that could have an impact, right? Because if the costs go from 6 to 4 through those funding instruments and the risking instruments, then even though the 4 is still relatively high, but that's already in the ballpark that could be acceptable for industry. Right? So I wouldn't discount the importance of the funding, even though indeed the cost of energy will stay as the main cost element going forward for sure. And I certainly see a potential for solid oxide in other areas than Nordics and Spain, because, as I mentioned, the industry that would be integrating those solid oxide electrolyzer exists mostly in Central Europe, like Germany, Poland, Netherlands. That's where those industries are.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay. In my view, the reason that SOEC is not deployed commercially yet is basically that product developers as well as debt investors don't understand economics. How do you get this knowledge into the development community?
Yes, it's true that there is a lot of, I mean, I wouldn't say they don't understand the economics, right? Those are the experts that they do understand the economics. They might not always understand the specificity of solid oxide electrolyzer economics. And there is indeed a lot of work that we need to do. We are trying to set up something also as part of our Hydrogen Week initiative to really start also put a lot more effort into opening a dialogue between the stakeholders, the industry stakeholders and the financial investors, banks, so that we create that common understanding between those various stakeholders. Because I certainly agree there is a knowledge gap that needs to be bridged. But it's not always that there is no understanding. It's just there is no data in some cases, right? About the long term and the lifetime operation of those electrolyzers in real environment. So we also need to be able to come up with the data and feed the data to the financial sector and the investors, because they do understand the risks well enough. We just need to help them understand that maybe they are not as big as they might think.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. It says, in my view, subsidies for proven technologies, PEM and alkaline, actually delay deployment of SOEC systems. Should funding not only be directed to systems with lower TRL, like AEM or SOEC?
Well, it depends on which type of funding, because when it comes to hydrogen bank or those kind of large scale funding from projects, those are competitive bids, and whoever can produce hydrogen at the lowest cost usually wins. It's not technology specific. But when it comes to R&D funding, so specifically those kind of technology development funding, there is indeed a bit of there are good arguments why we should keep those funds and use them to develop new technologies, and not all those, but there is still a lot to be done in those existing technologies as well. So I don't want to dismiss that altogether. I mean, it was mentioned by Shell that being able to produce hydrogen at a high pressure already from an electrolyzer, it kind of reduces the cost, and that's the case also for alkaline electrolysis just as much as for solid oxide. So there are elements that still can be developed even in those technologies that are maybe more mature. But in general, it's true that some technologies would benefit from more funding on that early and R&D space for sure.
Great, thank you very much. Just a couple more questions. The next one, it says, in Japan and Korea, as well as China, you do have country investment institutions bringing in an ecosystem of companies, so AM, EPCs, operators, traders, to get projects financed in developing countries. Shouldn't this be an approach to be copied by the EC? Or what is the view of Hydrogen Europe about this?
Yeah, it is certainly very interesting. I mean, we have instruments to do that, right? We have the AIB that can provide that kind of funding. But it's a little bit unfortunate. It is what it is. We have also a very fragmented national framework. So a lot of the investments and a lot of the developments still are within the jurisdiction of national governments. And it's not always easy to develop those kind of instruments at a EU central level because of that. So I would certainly say that this is a very attractive tool, and we should try to reuse those solutions that work. However, sometimes it's problematic to implement that at EU level, going that there are huge differences between member states.
Yeah, that's clear. Okay, next question. Shouldn't the focus of the EU being a region with insufficient biogenic carbon and minerals and high renewable electricity costs, except for Scandinavian and Iberian Peninsula, beyond setting up and supporting technology developers and OEMs to become the world's leading sector and start producing machines that can be deployed elsewhere?
Well, the clear answer is yes. I think we are at least attempting to do that, just that, right? So with all those Clean Industrial Deal initiatives, with made in Europe requirements for certain elements, I think the realization is there that this is the way forward. We need to try to have a very strong position in as a technology developer or a technology provider, not just to produce hydrogen. It's not always maybe implemented in the wisest way, but I think the realization that this is the way forward is there also at EU level, I think.
Great, thank you. And our final question for today. So it's cool to hear about the de-risking tools. I think that is the way forward, much better compared to subsidies. What can others do to stimulate this?
Well, that's something that it's a shame that it's not my colleague answering that, because we are currently working on a position paper exactly that. So I don't want to tell too much that's not true, but we certainly see this as an attractive option, and we try to push that forward, as I say, for the multi-annual financial framework that the discussions are now ongoing. That we certainly want the AIB to play a much more prominent role for that. They have the tools for that. They have the InvestEU. They have the expertise also how to do that. So again, from that point of view, we see the AIB should play a much higher role, but we also would benefit also from the information from the investors and actual project developers in knowing what exactly elements need to be the risks, for what items would they need guarantee, for how long. So those kind of specificities, which was also mentioned, I think, by Shell or by Paolo, I can't remember now, that some of the data is extremely difficult to get because of confidentiality reasons. So if the question is what can be done or what can stakeholders do to support us, I would encourage you to get in touch with us and share information where that kind of de-risking tools are actually needed to be deployed at a much more granular level than just saying the risking of technologies, right? But much more in detail about what exactly are the risk factors that can be addressed through this.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. Good. I think the person who answered this question has raised his hand and just wants to say something. So yes, Willem, go ahead. You should be able to talk.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Pawelec. Related to that last question, the main issue is not it's technology wise. It is basically technology. It's with the debt financiers in general. And if you look at solid oxide electrolyzers, debt financiers don't want to put money on the table because the systems are not deployed already. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit with equity financiers as well, but with debt financiers, it's even worse. And if you can just de-risk the way you just explained it, you basically get the risk away for solid oxide electrolyzers to be deployed and to get the debt finance in place. That's basically what I meant. And you can even bring it a little bit further. You can also do it a similar kind of insurance, whatever you call it, for at this moment OEMs that can deploy solid oxide electrolyzers. But project developers and equity investors basically quite often don't believe that they will realize a project for a certain CAPEX in total. And if you can ensure that basically if it goes up a certain level in which the party, basically the OEM can guarantee, and the OEM together with the EPC can guarantee the deployment for a certain price, mm-hmm. You can completely de-risk that part of the business. And if it is in an open book calculation, more or less, the insurance party doesn't have to pay normally because they never will go above that limit of price.
Mhm.
And I think you de-risk projects tremendously and get projects deployed tomorrow, more or less, if you follow that approach. If you want, I can explain that with some real projects in which I'm involved right now.
Yeah,
Thank you, Aaron.
that would be extremely valuable. Thank you for that. So, I mean, please do reach out. We are happy. I'm happy to schedule a call also with the team who's working on those de-risking tools, so we can elaborate and develop this further.
Yeah, yeah, we would be happy to put excuse me, to put you in touch with each other.
Yeah, perfect.
Good, great. Thanks, Willem. Good. So we will go ahead and end it off there. Again, thank you those who stayed, and thank you again to the speakers and Greg for your extra time. It's much appreciated. I hope it's been valuable for everyone. And yeah, we will leave it at that. And I wish everyone a nice day and a nice rest of your day and your weekend soon.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all.